Said all that, I will transition to the
state of the state.
The state of the state.
State of the state.
And, I mean, it's pretty clear the state is in some state of decay. Mass protests are popping off everywhere in the U.S., and this was a long time coming. On some level, I saw this coming, but on another level, I didn't, and I don't think anyone did that much. I remember thinking in 2017, what will it take for people to mass mobilize like they are now? Because there were protests at the beginning of the Trump administration, but many of them, or most of them, or all of them really, petered out. Remember, there were protests and riots right around when Trump got elected, and again when he took office. There was the Women's March, the airport protests, and more. All that stuff. From my perspective, the main reason that uprisings like that were quelled was because the Democrats and mainstream media desperately wanted to stop legitimate uprisings and instead funneled the political energy of their base into bureaucratic, esoteric stuff that you simply spectate, like the Russiagate narrative and the impeachment narrative. So on some level, I saw the type of protests that are going on coming because the conditions that yield protests were so clear. Things were happening all the time that are worth protesting, and yet people weren't protesting in a big society-sweeping way. And then another thing is, before coronavirus, I was long anticipating the economy to be where it currently is. Before I did this podcast, I would do a news roundup on my blog where I'd basically accumulate all the news I found interesting that week. In fact, my segment, The Facts and Logic Report...
Facts don't care about your feelings.
...where I talk about news is just a continuation of that in audio form. And one of the main things I would highlight is that economists were predicting the collapse of the economy since at least the middle of 2019. I thought that when the economy collapses is when people would begin protesting. And sure enough, that was rushed along by the coronavirus. I got a bad disease. Now, unemployment is like 30%. I think the official numbers of people on unemployment is about 15%, but there are many people who are unemployed but don't qualify for unemployment. There are also people who are highly underemployed, which used to count as unemployed but doesn't anymore. And there are people who are unemployed but aren't actively seeking employment, and they're not legally considered unemployed. So having said all that, true unemployment, not legal unemployment, is likely over 30% easily. And then on top of that is total distrust and hatred of the U.S. political establishment, frankly. And then, obviously, police continue killing people, primarily black people, brutally. These incidents are so gruesome and disgusting that even the people who are employed and middle class and live comfortably and have no sense of class consciousness are disgusted by it as well. I mean, obviously. It's easy for protests to rally against things like the killing of George Floyd because they're so obviously egregious to anyone, even middle class, anti-worker, anti-communist, anti-left people. And that's, all of that is how we got where we are now. I'm recording this podcast on Sunday, and I release it on Wednesdays, because I need a couple days to edit in my sound drops and music and all that. So things may have changed very quickly since I recorded this. They've already changed a lot these last couple days. I had to scrap some material I was going to use in this episode to talk about this more. I wanted to really focus on this and push back some other things I wanted to talk about. The protests going on right now are clearly of a different character than a lot of past protests. Even big protests that you think of, like I think of the 99 WTO riots, they feel more in line with those than they do, frankly, any other American protests I can think of like this. They don't really have much in common with Occupy, which was more of a kumbaya type movement. Kumbaya, my lord, kumbaya. This is categorically different. The idea of burning cop cars or police stations is seen as in the US, it's seen as things people do in other countries, but they don't do in the United States. With these escalated protests, it really just highlights police brutality more than it is normally highlighted. It shows that police are really willing to just beat, pepper spray, harass any people on the street. They're willing to push young women to the ground, pepper spray little girls, shoot gas canisters at people sitting on their porch, run over protesters like that, the little fascist worm in Charlottesville. They're willing to completely appropriate any violent tactic like that. And the intensity of police brutality is amplified by the fact that the National Guard and military are getting involved. It plainly shows that American cops are a domestic military. You can just slot in the National Guard and they do the same job as police. It shows that they're doing the same job. They are the same people. It's just the police are a domestic military. The cops live out in like McMansion hell with kids named stuff like Lycan and Taylor, and they commute an hour to the city. They have complete contempt for people who live in cities, who are proportionally more likely to be poor and more diverse than the people in their personal life. They're basically as close to an occupying force as one can get with it while still remaining in the same country. And then the real crazy part about it all is the police are just pretty openly and egregiously assaulting press. They hit someone from the press with pepper spray balls. Like it looks like a paintball gun, but it had like pepper spray balls in them. And then they hit a journalist in the eye with a gas canister. They've detained multiple journalists on film now. And, I mean, there's so many things I could talk about that have happened the past few days that really open up people's eyes and thoughts to different things. And because of this, people will say stuff like, America has changed. And in a way, it has, because things are always changing. But this isn't really a change to the system. Nothing has systematically changed. These dynamics have been embedded into the American political system since the beginning. What happens is, instead of America changing, conditions change over time. And as conditions change, they show the same system from different angles. When the tensions in economic and social society become more apparent, people respond to the system in different ways, and the system responds back in different ways. What we are seeing is the United States for what it always has been. Normally, the people on the receiving end are farmers in Vietnam or ranchers in like Afghanistan or Iraq, or hunters who were indigenous to America or Africans taken from their homeland or any other group of people victim of the U.S. around the world. American protesters aren't being exposed to even a fraction of the death imposed on colonized people like that. But we are still seeing it. It's that element is poking out at us. The police see themselves as an occupying force, and they're no longer afraid to show you. And one last thing that the ideological apparatuses of the United States have been doing a lot that is a complete smear job against the protests. This is usually the liberal approach rather than the conservative one, is the narrative of the outside agitators. Obviously, this is a flawed narrative for many reasons. For one, what they mean by outside agitators is maybe people from the next town, not next town, next state over, maybe a couple states over. They drove into state to take part of the protests. They try to dismiss the protests by saying they were done by outside agitators. But how can they be outside when they live in the same society with the same repression, same economic system? Everything is the same. They just live in the next town over. What they want to do is make people associate the protesters with, say, Russians, Chinese. That's the association they're going for with outside agitators, because it's such a meaningless scare phrase that it actually, it doesn't mean anything. It just makes people think about big scary boogeyman or like KGB. And then the other element of it is it's used by the Democratic Party ideological apparatus to tell black people, listen, the left isn't going to help you. They're all outside agitators. They're just these white anarchists LARPing from out of state. They're not helping you. They're making you look bad. Come back to the Democratic Party. We'll take care of you. It is absolutely a tactic to divide the left amongst race. This is a tactic that is used by the capitalist class actually all the time. The Republican Party uses it all the time, very explicitly, but the Democratic Party uses it implicitly all the time, and the way they'll do so is they'll pretend they have invested interests in a minority group doing well, and then they juxtapose different groups with their interests. A perfect example that is even more obvious is, say, during the 92 riots, where the ideological apparatuses really wanted to highlight the the split between the Korean community and the black community. Obviously, that was one of the primary reasons why the riots started, was a Korean store owner killing a black person in the store. And, there's obviously, the Koreans who were protecting their businesses from rioting with, guns on the roof. Those things are true, but that is very overemphasized, and it's made a bigger deal out of it, because obviously the bigger conflict was between white people and black people. It was between poor people and rich people, not black people and Koreans. That was just an element of a broader overarching thing. So the point I'm trying to make is, the capitalist class loves splitting people up by race, and they say they are doing so to help black interests or, say, Asian interests, whatever interests. They're saying split up because of race, because you have specific interests in these racial policies. In reality, left-wing policies, because they're more universalized, they help people more equally. For example, the Democratic Party will give you some means-tested thing where you have to qualify for it, and you have to do this or that. And what this ends up doing, to give an example, let's say food stamps. If everyone in the country got food stamps, it would help strip away elements of our class society. But they will never do that because they want to use food stamps to reify class positioning. In the same way, they want to use racial issues to reify class positioning. They say only the Democrats can help you with this issue that is specific to your race. When in reality, let's say, go back to the food stamps example. If everyone got food stamps, black people it would not be possible to marginalize black people and poor people for getting food stamps. There would never be the narrative about, like, mocking people for government cheese and that type of shit that's, like, antiquated now. So, my point overall is that this narrative about outside agitators is really just a ploy to make the rioters seem like they're almost like white nationalists. They're this outside group. They just want to make destruction. They're not associated with the protests in any meaningful way, when that's not how it is at all. And I realize I'm kind of resulted to rambling at the end of this, but so I'll leave it there.
State of the state.
That was the state of the state.
State of the state.